In small towns, secrets travel slower than gossip but burn twice as long. Maple Ridge County, Arkansas, a stretch of pine forests and gravel roads that people describe as peaceful, or maybe just isolated. On the afternoon of July 18, 2018, that peace broke under a column of black smoke rising above the trees. When firefighters reached the Dawson property, the house was already collapsing in on itself. The flames had eaten through the walls, windows bursting one after another. Inside, they expected to find no one. What they found instead was the body of a woman, later identified as Hannah Dawson, 40 years old, a beloved local teacher and volunteer. Hannah's life, from the outside, looked like the kind of small-town normal that rarely makes headlines. She taught kindergarten in town for nearly 15 years, then stepped away after an injury to focus on home projects. Friends describe her as gentle, the kind of woman who baked pies for the volunteer fire station and fostered stray animals. She lived with her husband, Michael Hendricks, the respected fire chief of North Creek Fire Department. Their home sat on 100 acres of wooded land, far from neighbors, close to silence. But beneath that silence, something else had been growing. Hannah's family would later tell investigators she'd become anxious, suspicious even. She told her sister, Rachel, that she felt watched. At first, they thought it was just the loneliness of rural life. Then, the messages started. Texts from unknown numbers, short, ugly things. Keep quiet or you'll regret it. A week before the fire, she told Rachel about a confrontation with Michael's younger brother, Lucas Hendricks, a man just out of prison, angry and unpredictable. He blamed Hannah for his probation conditions, saying she'd poisoned the family against him. After that, Hannah convinced Michael to install security cameras around the property, 8 in total, watching the drive, the doors, the barns. For a while, she said she slept better. Then one morning, the system went dead. All 8 cameras offline, the DVR unresponsive. Michael promised to check it that weekend. He never got the chance. July 18th began quietly. At 8:12 a.m., a traffic camera captured Hannah's SUV pulling through the drive-thru of a diner on Route 67. She ordered coffee and a breakfast sandwich, paid with her debit card, and drove south toward home. That was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. From there, the timeline blurs. Cell tower records show her phone at the Dawson property until early afternoon. Around 2:34 p.m., a neighbor called 911. Smoke was rising from the ridge behind the tree line. Dispatch contacted the North Creek station. Michael Hendricks was on duty, logged into a training session and recorded on internal surveillance at the time the fire began. By the time his crew reached the house, the roof had collapsed. The flames were too strong to enter. When they finally got inside, hours later, they found Hannah in the master bathroom, curled on the floor, near the shower. At first, the story seemed tragically simple. A house fire, a victim trapped inside. But something didn't sit right. The alarms hadn't triggered. Hannah's car was still in the garage. And then there was the position of her body, not near an exit, but deep inside, as if she'd never tried to escape. Investigators noticed something else. Her lungs were clean. No soot, no smoke inhalation. She hadn't been breathing when the fire started. The following day, forensic pathologists performed an autopsy. Their conclusion changed everything. A single gunshot wound to the head, fatal, before the fire. Suddenly, the quiet tragedy turned into a homicide. Arson investigators combed the ruins and found what they were looking for: multiple points of ignition, traces of accelerant soaked into the wood flooring. Someone had set this fire deliberately, and they'd done it well enough to delay discovery and destroy evidence. 2 burn handguns were recovered from the debris, neither matching the bullet fragments pulled from Hannah's skull. The cameras she'd insisted on installing were gone. Melted frames, corrupted drives. Someone had known exactly where they were. With the cameras gone and the trail cooling fast, investigators turned to the people closest to her. Michael Hendricks, the husband, was first in line. He'd been at the station all morning, his presence confirmed by co-workers and security footage. He agreed to a polygraph test and passed. Still, detectives kept him close. It was standard procedure, but in Maple Ridge, rumors moved faster than evidence. Within days, his reputation as the county's fire chief had turned into something else: the man whose wife was found in a fire he couldn't stop. Next came Lucas Hendricks, Michael's brother. Lucas was living with their parents just 10 miles away, under supervision with an electronic ankle monitor. It should have been the perfect alibi, except for one thing. The device had no data from July 18th. The entire day's GPS log was blank. Officials blamed a technical fault. Hannah's family called it something else. Between 9 a.m. and 2 p.m., 5 hours of Hannah's life disappeared. No calls, no texts, no security footage. Only one unexplained event remains in the record: a brief outgoing call from her phone to a number she'd never dialed before. The recipient, a woman from another county, said she'd never met Hannah. The call lasted 6 seconds. Investigators couldn't make sense of it, but to Rachel Dawson, Hannah's sister, it felt deliberate, like a signal, a fragment left behind. When Rachel and her father arrived at the property 2 days after the fire, they were stunned. The site hadn't been sealed. Caution tape flapped in the breeze, but the house itself was open. Michael Hendricks was already there, sifting through ashes for personal items. That, Rachel says, was the moment her trust in local law enforcement broke. They let him walk through it, she told reporters later. They let him walk through her crime scene. Later that same day, Michael's teenage son found something among the debris, what appeared to be a fragment of human bone. It was turned over to investigators, who finally ordered the property closed. But by then, any trace evidence might have been lost to wind, rain, or boots in the mud. The county sheriff, Randy Cole, faced a storm of criticism. His department insisted they were treating the case as suspicious but undetermined. Yet the forensics said otherwise: homicide and arson. When asked about it at a press conference, Cole hesitated. "We are not ruling anything out," he said, "including self-inflicted circumstances." To Hannah's family, it sounded like denial. To others, it sounded like politics. Behind closed doors, state investigators from Little Rock began to question whether local officials were protecting one of their own. After all, the lead suspect's brother was the county's own fire chief. Conflict of interest or coincidence? No one could prove either. The house on Ridge Road is gone now. Only the concrete foundation and a rusted mailbox remain, the name Dawson still faintly legible under the soot. For Rachel, it's not just the loss of her sister, it's the loss of faith. They said they'd find the truth, she told a local paper, but all they found was silence. And that silence has lasted years. What happened in those missing hours? Who pulled the trigger before lighting the match? As investigators struggled to keep the case alive, one thing became clear: the fire in Maple Ridge didn't end when the flames died. It only changed shape. In Part 2, we'll trace the aftermath, the competing investigations, the family's private hunt for answers, and the one piece of evidence that may still speak from beneath the ash. When the fire in Maple Ridge went out, the questions began to burn hotter than the flames ever did. Weeks had passed since the night Hannah Dawson's body was found, and the smell of smoke still clung to the trees around Ridge Road. Investigators had confirmed what the family already feared: this was no accident. Someone had killed Hannah before setting her house on fire. But as summer turned into fall, the search for justice began to stall. Evidence was thin, timelines were messy, and the people who should have been protecting the truth seemed to be protecting something else. The official investigation dragged on. Sheriff Randy Cole held tight to his version of events, repeating in every press briefing that all options remain open. His words sounded careful, rehearsed, and painfully hollow. Behind him, a board filled with maps and timelines looked impressive to the cameras, but little of it meant progress. Hannah's sister, Rachel, attended every briefing, her notebook filling with details that never added up. She asked questions that no one wanted to answer. Why hadn't the cameras been checked sooner? Why was the fire scene reopened so quickly? And why did the sheriff refuse outside help from state investigators who offered to take over? Privately, the family began building their own file. Rachel called it the real case. She spent nights combing through documents, saving screenshots, and interviewing anyone who might have noticed something on July 18th. Her father, Harold, grew quiet during those weeks, his energy drained by grief and frustration. They had lost Hannah, but now it felt like they were losing the truth, too. Then came the news that made everything worse. 2 months after the fire, Sheriff Cole publicly announced that Michael Hendricks, the husband, the fire chief, was no longer considered a person of interest. "We have verified his alibi," he said, and found no evidence linking him directly to the fire. The press conference lasted less than 10 minutes. Rachel stood outside the courthouse afterward, gripping the folded statement in her hand. The words blurred together: no longer a suspect. She wanted to scream. The investigation was barely 2 months old, and already the door was closing. In the weeks that followed, the family pushed back. They sent letters to the district attorney's office, filed public record requests, demanded transparency. Most of their letters went unanswered. When documents did arrive, pages were missing or blacked out entirely. The reason given was always the same: ongoing investigation. Yet it didn't look like much was still being investigated. Deputies stopped visiting the Dawson property, and evidence remained in storage. The trail was going cold. By the end of that year, the house had been cleared, the ashes bulldozed into a mound behind what used to be the kitchen. The land looked empty, almost peaceful. But Rachel couldn't drive past without stopping. She said the quiet there made her angry. It was too clean, too silent. Nothing about it felt finished. Around that same time, whispers began spreading through town. People said Hannah might have taken her own life, that maybe guilt or depression had driven her to it. Some said Michael had left her alone too often, that the marriage had soured. Others hinted that Hannah was unstable, paranoid, even obsessive about the cameras she'd installed. Each rumor chipped away at her memory. To the family, it was another kind of murder, this one of reputation. Rachel refused to let that be the final story. She reached out to journalists, online forums, even true crime podcasters. A small podcast called Voices Unheard picked up the case, airing a 2-part episode that questioned the inconsistencies in the sheriff's report. The podcast didn't solve anything, but it drew attention. Emails began arriving from listeners, some sharing similar stories of mishandled investigations, others offering support. For the first time, Rachel felt like someone outside Maple Ridge was listening. Meanwhile, state investigators from Little Rock quietly reviewed the case. They didn't say it publicly, but internal memos suggested concern about potential procedural errors. Still, without jurisdiction, their hands were tied. The sheriff's office refused to relinquish control. Every lead ended in paperwork, every request in silence. A year passed. The investigation remained open, but stagnant. The case number appeared occasionally in local reports, usually attached to phrases like "no new developments" or "still under review." People in town stopped asking about it. The Dawsons didn't. They met once a week at Rachel's house, comparing notes, watching the same pieces of evidence again and again. The broken DVR. The missing bullet match. The mysterious 6-second phone call. None of it fit cleanly together, but Rachel believed every puzzle has an edge. You just have to find the border first. In early 2020, a private forensic consultant named Evan Blake contacted the family after hearing about the case online. A retired fire investigator, Blake offered to review the reports pro bono. When Rachel handed him the binder she'd built, he stayed silent for a long time, flipping through the charred photos and inconsistent diagrams. Finally, he said, "It's not what they're saying it is." He pointed to discrepancies: ignition points too far apart for a single fire source, patterns suggesting accelerant poured in a deliberate trail, and the absence of any fire origin report signed by the lead county investigator. Blake's conclusion was firm: this was staged. Rachel brought the findings to Sheriff Cole's office. The meeting lasted less than 15 minutes. Cole dismissed Blake as a hobbyist and warned Rachel to stop interfering. When she asked about the missing GPS data from Lucas Hendricks's ankle monitor, Cole leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Those logs get corrupted all the time," he said. "It doesn't mean anything." To Rachel, it meant everything. By late 2021, the Dawsons had exhausted every channel within Maple Ridge. They appealed directly to the state attorney general, sending a formal request to reopen the case under independent review. Months passed before they heard back. The response was a single page: request received. Under consideration. Nothing more. The silence felt heavier than ever. Then, in 2023, a new name entered the picture: District Attorney Eli Sanders. Recently elected on a platform of government accountability, Sanders had made his career prosecuting corruption cases in the state capitol. When he took office, Rachel sent him a letter and a copy of Blake's independent report. To her surprise, he called her himself. "I can't promise a miracle," he said, "but I can promise a look." True to his word, Sanders reopened the case files. He ordered the physical evidence re-examined by state labs and asked to interview both Michael and Lucas Hendricks again. The sheriff's department resisted, but Sanders had authority they couldn't ignore. Within weeks, new subpoenas went out, new technicians visited the scene, and for the first time in 5 years, the case file grew thicker instead of dustier. For Rachel, it was hope, fragile but real. She visited the old property once more that spring. The grass had grown tall over the concrete foundation, and wildflowers pushed through the cracks. She stood there for a long time, watching the light fade through the pines. In the distance, thunder rolled across the ridge, the sound almost like applause or warning. Reporters began to circle again. When asked if he believed foul play was still possible, District Attorney Sanders gave a careful answer. "We are following the evidence," he said. "And evidence doesn't burn as easily as people think." His tone was steady, his eyes unwavering. Behind that statement was quiet momentum. New forensic analysis confirmed that the accelerant found on site matched a brand of industrial fuel distributed only to licensed emergency departments. Investigators traced a purchase made 2 days before the fire using a department account. The paperwork had been signed electronically. The name on the document, Michael Hendricks. No one wanted to believe it. Not the firefighters who'd worked beside him, not the neighbors who'd praised him for years. But facts, unlike loyalty, don't bend easily. When questioned, Michael said he'd ordered the fuel for a controlled training exercise that never happened. The receipts, he claimed, had been mixed up. He denied any connection to the fire at his own home. The new findings didn't lead to an arrest, at least, not yet, but they reopened everything that had gone quiet. For Rachel, it was vindication, proof that persistence still mattered. For the sheriff's office, it was humiliation. And for Maple Ridge County, it was a reminder that the truth, once buried, always finds its way back to the surface. Now, 6 years after the fire, the case of Hannah Dawson remains open. No one has been charged, no one cleared. The county still whispers theories, the family still waits. On the edge of town, the old mailbox still stands, its letters rusted but readable, Dawson. And when the wind blows just right through the pine trees, the faint smell of smoke returns, as if the fire never truly went out, just found new ways to burn. The 3rd year after the fire brought a strange calm to Maple Ridge, the kind of silence that feels heavy rather than peaceful. The investigation was technically open, but nobody talked about it anymore. For most people, it was just a tragedy that had faded into rumor. For the Dawson family, it was unfinished business that refused to die. Rachel Dawson still kept a small office above her garage, a cluttered space filled with files, maps, and boxes of printed emails. On one wall hung the timeline of her sister's last day, red string connecting photographs and handwritten notes. Every time she looked at it, she felt both closer to the truth and further away. By 2024, District Attorney Eli Sanders had been in office for nearly a year. He'd kept his promise to review the case, quietly assigning a pair of young investigators from Little Rock to re-examine everything from scratch. They brought new methods, new technology, and something the old sheriff's department had long lost, patience. Sanders had told Rachel early on, "We move slow, but we move straight." It was the first time anyone in authority had spoken to her like an ally rather than an obstacle. The new team began by cross-referencing digital records, cell data, financial transactions, archived emails, trying to piece together the final hours before the fire. One discovery stood out. On the morning of July 18th, 2 hours before Hannah's last recorded phone activity, Michael Hendricks had logged into a restricted system used by county fire officials to requisition materials. Among the digital forms was an order for 12 gallons of industrial accelerant, signed under his credentials. The product had never been delivered to the station, nor used in any training exercise. The paperwork simply vanished into the system, until now. When questioned, Michael insisted he'd placed the order by mistake, claiming it was part of an automated purchase batch. But the new investigators noticed that he had personally approved the transaction from his home computer, not his office terminal. The timestamp matched a lull in his morning schedule, just before his shift began at North Creek Fire Department. It wasn't proof of guilt, but it was a loose thread worth pulling. While that was unfolding, Rachel was doing her own digging. Through a contact at a data recovery firm, she managed to restore partial footage from one of Hannah's melted security drives. Most of it was unreadable static, but one 5-second clip survived. The frame was distorted, flickering between color and monochrome, but it showed a tall figure walking across the porch in broad daylight. The angle was poor, the image grainy, but Rachel froze the moment again and again. The man's build was familiar: broad shoulders, short hair, dark jacket. She brought it to Sanders's office the next morning. They couldn't confirm who it was, but it added weight to a theory Sanders had been building. "This wasn't random," he told her quietly. "Whoever did this knew the house, knew her schedule, and knew exactly what to erase. His tone was measured, but the implication hung in the air. Weeks later, forensic technicians from the state lab completed a reanalysis of trace materials collected at the scene years earlier. Among the samples from the master bedroom's doorway, they found microscopic fragments of nitrile, a material used in industrial gloves issued to emergency personnel. The residue matched the type distributed to the North Creek Fire Department during that same year. It was circumstantial, but powerful. When Sanders presented the findings to the sheriff's office, he met resistance. Sheriff Cole, still clinging to his position, accused the DA of politicizing an old tragedy. The tension between them spilled into local headlines. Small-town newspapers framed it as a clash of egos, but Rachel knew better. For her, it was the sound of truth grinding against the machinery of denial. One evening, as autumn crept across the pines, Sanders invited Rachel to his office. The air smelled faintly of coffee and rain. On his desk lay a photograph of Michael Hendricks in his fire uniform, taken years before the tragedy. Sanders pointed to it. "He's not untouchable," he said. "But if we move, we need to be absolutely sure." Rachel nodded, feeling both hope and dread. She'd wanted this for so long, but part of her still couldn't bear the idea that the man who'd once called her sister his whole world might have been the one to destroy it. In December, the DA's team obtained a warrant to re-interview Michael. The session took place at a neutral site, away from county officers. For over 2 hours, he answered questions calmly, his tone professional, his body language controlled. Then Sanders asked about the 6-second phone call, the one Hannah had made to a stranger just before she died. Michael paused, just for a heartbeat too long. "I don't know anything about that," he said. His voice didn't waver, but his hands tightened on the table. Afterward, one investigator noted in the transcript, subject appeared unsettled for the remainder of the interview. Not long after, another lead emerged. The woman who had received that mysterious call came forward again, saying she'd remembered something new. The number Hannah dialed was linked to an old landline once used by a volunteer fire substation, one that Michael had supervised before transferring to North Creek. The phone had since been disconnected, but the routing system remained in the records. It was as if Hannah had tried to reach someone at the department, maybe even to warn them. No one could be sure what she was trying to say. As the year turned, pressure mounted on the sheriff's office. Citizens began asking questions at town meetings. Journalists revisited the story. Under scrutiny, Sheriff Cole announced his retirement, citing health reasons. For Rachel, it felt like the first crack in a wall that had stood for too long. The next spring brought another discovery. A retired firefighter named Paul Gentry contacted the DA's office claiming he'd seen something the day before the fire. He remembered Michael stopping by the station after hours, loading equipment into the back of his truck, items that included sealed metal canisters. At the time, Gentry thought nothing of it. Now, hearing about the reopened investigation, he realized the detail might matter. The canisters were the same type used to store accelerants for controlled burns. Sanders had enough to request a grand jury review. It wasn't an indictment, but it was a doorway. For the Dawson family, it felt like the beginning of the end. Rachel attended every hearing, sitting quietly in the back row, hands clasped, heart steady. She didn't need revenge. She needed the truth to exist somewhere official, not just in her notebooks and memories. In June, after weeks of deliberation, the grand jury returned its recommendation: sufficient cause to pursue criminal charges for obstruction of justice and tampering with evidence. Michael Hendricks wasn't charged with murder, at least not yet, but for the first time, his name appeared in a courtroom as a defendant. The headlines spread beyond Arkansas. Fire chief under investigation in wife's mysterious death. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, cameras waiting for a glimpse. Michael arrived in a grey suit, eyes hidden behind dark glasses. He said nothing to the press. His lawyer claimed the case was built on coincidence and conjecture. Inside, Sanders spoke softly but firmly. He presented the recovered footage, the purchase order, the lab analysis, and the witness testimony. Piece by piece, the story that had once been rumor became evidence. When the session ended, Rachel stepped outside into the humid afternoon air. The courthouse steps were crowded, the sound of cameras clicking like insects in the heat. She didn't speak to anyone. Instead, she walked down the sidewalk toward the square, where the old clock tower struck 4 times. For the first time in 6 years, the sound didn't feel hollow. No verdict came that day, but the silence in Maple Ridge changed. People spoke Hannah's name again, at grocery lines, at church, at town meetings. Some defended Michael, others whispered apologies for ever doubting the Dawsons. Truth had begun to ripple outward, slow but unstoppable. Late one evening, Rachel returned to the property. The moon hung low over the ridge, pale and full. She stood beside the leaning mailbox and traced her fingers over the letters. D, A, W, S, O, N, rusted but still there. In the distance, the trees swayed like witnesses. She closed her eyes and whispered, "We are almost there, Hannah." The camera would fade out here, the air thick with night sounds and the faint hum of cicadas. In the darkness, a single ember drifted across the frame, glowing for a heartbeat before fading away, a reminder that every fire, no matter how carefully buried, leaves something behind. The story of Maple Ridge wasn't finished, but for the first time, it was finally burning toward the truth. The air in Maple Ridge had changed. It wasn't just the summer heat or the heavy scent of pine. It was the weight of knowing that, after years of silence, someone was finally talking. The courthouse sessions had ended, but the ripples kept spreading. For the first time, the name Hannah Dawson carried something more than tragedy. It carried questions that demanded answers. District Attorney Eli Sanders sat alone in his office one evening, the blinds half-drawn, papers scattered across his desk. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the old ceiling fan. He replayed a recording from Michael Hendricks's last interview. The man's voice was steady, too steady. Sanders had worked enough cases to know that calm wasn't always innocence. It was control. He rewound a section and listened again, stopping at a small hesitation in Michael's tone when asked about the missing accelerant order. That pause, less than a second long, spoke louder than any confession. Meanwhile, Rachel Dawson was living with two timelines, the one that ended in fire, and the one she was still writing. Every morning she brewed a pot of coffee, sat at her kitchen table, and opened her laptop to check for updates from Sanders's team. She'd stopped hoping for closure. What she wanted now was clarity. She wanted the truth laid bare, no matter how much it hurt. In August, a new piece of evidence surfaced. A former county IT contractor, cleaning out old archives, found a damaged hard drive labeled Fire Department, 2017 training footage. On it were several internal recordings from the week before the fire. One clip showed Michael Hendricks at the training yard with a group of junior firefighters, demonstrating controlled burns. He moved with confidence, explaining how accelerants worked, how flame spread could be directed by wind and structure. His tone was educational, almost rehearsed. Then, as the camera panned away, he said something half-joking, half-sinister. "Fire's like people. You control it, or it controls you." The remark might have been harmless, but in hindsight, it sounded like prophecy. When the footage reached Sanders's desk, he called Rachel immediately. "It doesn't prove murder," he said, "but it shows intent. It shows knowledge." To him, that mattered. To her, it was personal. She could still hear Michael's voice from the day of Hannah's funeral, standing by the gravesite, telling everyone how much he loved his wife. "Fire took her from me," he had said then. Now those words carried a different burn. The investigation deepened. Forensic accountants traced Michael's financial records and found irregularities. Small transfers, cash withdrawals, missing departmental reimbursements. Nothing dramatic, but enough to show a pattern of quiet manipulation. Sanders knew what that meant: leverage, blackmail, or desperation. He kept digging. By late September, a confidential informant came forward. A former firefighter from North Creek named Kevin Mills, who had resigned shortly after the fire, claimed he'd been told to stay quiet about supply orders that didn't match station usage. He remembered a conversation with Michael 2 days after the fire. "He told me not to talk to reporters," Mills said. "Said the case would wrap itself up." "I thought he was just shaken. Now I'm not so sure." Sanders arranged for Mills to testify under oath. When news of the upcoming hearing leaked, the small town turned restless again. At diners and barbershops, people debated guilt and loyalty. Some defended Michael, saying no man who'd saved so many lives could take one. Others weren't so sure. "Even heroes of shadows," one old farmer said. Rachel tried to stay out of the gossip, but she could feel the pressure building. She'd spent 6 years chasing ghosts. Now the story was unfolding in real time, and she wasn't sure she was ready. One night, she drove back to the old property. The mailbox still leaned, the letters half buried under rust. She sat on the hood of her car, watching the moon rise through the trees, and whispered into the dark, "We are getting closer, Hannah." I can feel it. When the hearing finally began, the courtroom was smaller than anyone expected. Wooden benches, faded flags, and the hum of ceiling lights. Sanders stood at the front, calm and deliberate. He called Mills to the stand. The man's hands trembled as he recounted his story. The mismatched records, the missing canisters, the warning from Michael. Every word felt like a spark hitting dry tinder. Michael's lawyer objected repeatedly, arguing hearsay, lack of material evidence. But the momentum was shifting. When Sanders projected a side-by-side comparison of the department's fuel logs and the fire's chemical report, the match was undeniable. The same composition, the same density, the same chemical signature. The courtroom fell into an uneasy quiet. Michael didn't react at first. He sat motionless, eyes forward, jaw tight. Then, slowly, he leaned toward his attorney, whispering something the microphones couldn't catch. Rachel watched from the back row, her heartbeat echoing in her ears. She wasn't sure if she wanted him to speak or stay silent. When the session ended, Sanders requested an adjournment for further review. Outside, the air felt heavy, the town square filled with reporters again. The courthouse steps had become a stage. Sanders gave a short statement. This is not about revenge. This is about accountability. Rachel stood off to the side, watching him, feeling something between gratitude and exhaustion. Days later, the news broke. State prosecutors were considering expanding the charges to include negligent homicide and obstruction of justice. It wasn't the full truth yet, but it was closer than it had ever been. The headline spread across Arkansas. Fire chief faces new allegations in wife's death. Michael was placed on administrative leave pending review. But Maple Ridge wasn't done whispering. Some said the case was political, that Sanders wanted a headline. Others said the Dawsons were exploiting tragedy for attention. Rachel ignored them. She'd learned long ago that the truth didn't need everyone's belief. It only needed to stand on its own. Then came the phone call. Late one night, Sanders called her again. His voice was tired but steady. "We've recovered something," he said. An audio clip from the DVR's internal MIC, just before the system went offline. He didn't say more, only that she should come to Little Rock in the morning. The next day, Rachel sat in a small soundproof room with Sanders and two technicians. They played the recording. The audio was faint, distorted by static, but Hannah's voice was unmistakable. She sounded calm, speaking into her phone. "If anything happens, tell Rachel it wasn't an accident." Then came a pause, footsteps, a door opening, and a man's voice, low, familiar, just one word, "Don't." The recording cut off. Rachel froze. The room felt colder than it should have. Sanders didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, it was barely above a whisper. "We can't identify him yet," he said. "But we will." In the following weeks, that single clip became the cornerstone of a renewed investigation. Experts enhanced the audio, traced its metadata, and confirmed the timestamp aligned with the last moments before the fire. Public pressure surged. The county board finally authorized the transfer of the case to state jurisdiction. For Rachel, it was both a victory and a wound reopened. Winter settled over Maple Ridge, covering the ruins of the old house in Frost. The investigation continued behind closed doors, slow but deliberate. Michael's name remained on the docket, his future uncertain. And through it all, Rachel kept writing in her notebook, documenting every development, every fragment of truth reclaimed from the ashes. On a cold December night, she stood once more on Ridge Road. The trees were bare, the air still. In the distance, a single porch light glowed from a neighboring farmhouse. She closed her eyes, letting the silence stretch. For the first time in years, it didn't feel empty. It felt like space clearing for something new. The fire in Maple Ridge had destroyed everything once, but it had also illuminated what people tried to bury. In its glow, the lies had burned away, leaving only what refused to vanish, the persistence of truth, and a sister who never stopped chasing it. The winter of 2025 arrived early in Maple Ridge. Frost covered the pine needles and quieted the ground where the Dawson house once stood. The investigation had slowed again, buried beneath red tape and exhaustion, but something felt different this time. The evidence was no longer whispers. It had a voice, faint and broken, but real. The recovered audio changed everything. District Attorney Eli Sanders spent his nights listening to it over and over, headphones pressed tight, searching for details between the static. Each pause, each breath, every scrape of sound told a story. Hannah's final words, "If anything happens, tell Rachel it wasn't an accident," had become a haunting refrain. It was proof that she'd known something was coming, that her death wasn't random. And that voice, the man who answered with a single word, "Don't," was still somewhere out there, breathing free air. Rachel Dawson didn't sleep much after that. She would sit at her kitchen window long after midnight, the glow of her laptop screen washing her face pale. She'd replay the recording until she could almost hear things that weren't there: background noise, the faint hum of wind, maybe even the sound of a door closing. Every time, she convinced herself it was another clue. Sanders's team continued the forensic breakdown. They isolated frequencies, cleaned static, and ran the voice through federal databases. After weeks of comparisons, the results came back inconclusive. The voice didn't match anyone in official law enforcement records, but one match surfaced from a training video stored in the county's archives. It was Michael Hendricks. The waveform alignment wasn't perfect, but the probability range was high enough to reopen everything. The DA's office prepared quietly. Sanders knew this wasn't a case that could rely on headlines. It had to be built piece by piece, without mistakes. He met with Rachel again in late January, in his office that smelled of coffee and paper dust. "We are close," he told her. "But close isn't enough. If we push too soon, the defense will tear it apart." Rachel nodded, staring at the framed flag on his wall. "Just don't let her be forgotten again," she said. Meanwhile, Michael Hendricks had vanished from public life. His resignation from the North Creek Fire Department came quietly through a legal statement. No interviews, no appearances. His property had been sold to a private buyer, and locals said he'd moved to another county. But investigators track his phone records, several calls to a former colleague, a firefighter named Sam Porter, who had worked under him for years. Porter had left the department in 2018 and was now living in Texas. Sanders's team paid him a visit. In a motel room outside Dallas, Porter admitted that Michael had called him shortly after the fire, asking him to get rid of some old station supplies. Porter never said what those supplies were, but his tone betrayed guilt. When the investigators pressed, he said, "I didn't know back then. I thought he was just cleaning up." They showed him a photo of the accelerant canisters. Porter swallowed hard. "Yeah," he whispered. "That's what he gave me." The confession gave Sanders what he needed: a direct link between Michael and the missing accelerant. Within weeks, a warrant was issued for further search and forensic retrieval. But before authorities could make their move, news broke that Michael Hendricks had checked himself into a hospital in another county, citing stress-related health issues. Some saw it as cowardice. Others said it was guilt. Rachel didn't celebrate. She'd learned that justice was never quick, and truth rarely clean. She focused on details. She revisited the property one more time with Sanders and the investigative team. Snow fell lightly that morning, softening the ruins of what once was a sister's home. Sanders stood beside her, hands in his coat pockets. "We may finally have enough," he said. "It won't undo what happened, but it can stop it from being erased." Later that week, prosecutors convened a new grand jury. Sanders presented everything: the voice analysis, the accelerant trail, the recovered testimony, the financial irregularities, and now Porter's confession. Piece by piece, he painted a timeline that led back to one man, one who had knowledge, access, and motive. When the final slide of the presentation faded to black, the room sat in silence. The jurors didn't look shocked. They looked tired. It was the kind of case that wears on everyone. The indictment came down on a cold Thursday morning. Michael Hendricks was officially charged with second-degree murder and arson. The news broke fast, spreading through the county like wildfire. Reporters returned, trucks lined the courthouse square, and cameras blinked under grey skies. When Michael was escorted inside in handcuffs, his face unreadable, Rachel stood on the opposite side of the steps, watching. No satisfaction crossed her face, only a quiet exhale, like she'd been holding her breath for 7 years. Inside the courtroom, Sanders read the charges. The judge's voice was steady, clinical. Michael's attorney pleaded not guilty, claiming the entire case was built on circumstantial evidence and faulty data. The trial date was set for the following summer. Rachel attended every pre-hearing, sitting in the same back row seat she'd occupied for years. Each session blurred together: motions, arguments, procedural delays. But for her, every minute mattered. Every second her sister's name was spoken aloud was a victory. As winter turned to spring, the trial began. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. Sanders opened simply, "This case is not about fire. It's about control. And about what happens when control turns into fear." He played the recovered audio for the jury. Hannah's voice filled the room again. "If anything happens, tell Rachel it wasn't an accident." Gasps rippled through the audience. The voice that followed, low, commanding, unmistakable, sealed the silence that came after. The defense fought back hard. They called character witnesses, firefighters who praised Michael's service, experts who questioned the forensic analysis. They claimed the recording was manipulated, that the prosecution was framing a dedicated public servant. But the evidence spoke quietly and consistently. Every pattern, every detail, every lie chipped away at the image of the man once seen as a hero. Rachel sat through it all, her eyes never leaving the man at the defense table. Sometimes she wondered if he felt any remorse. Other times, she wondered if he even believed he'd done anything wrong. The trial lasted 3 weeks. When the verdict finally came, it was delivered in a room so quiet you could hear the clock ticking. The jury foreman rose, paper trembling slightly in his hand. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Michael Hendricks, guilty of arson in the 1st degree and guilty of 2nd-degree murder." There was no outburst, no applause. Just silence. Michael closed his eyes, expression unreadable. Rachel felt her knees weaken. Sanders placed a steady hand on her shoulder, and for the first time, she let herself cry. Not because the pain was gone, but because it finally had a name. In the months that followed, Maple Ridge began to heal. The town stopped whispering. People spoke Hannah's name with respect again, not suspicion. A small memorial was built near the ruins of her house, just a simple plaque that read, "She believed truth would survive the fire." She was right. Rachel visited often. Sometimes she brought flowers. Sometimes she just stood there, letting the wind move through the trees. The air no longer smelled of smoke, only pine and rain. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the ridge, she whispered, "We did it, Hannah." And for a moment, the world around her felt still, as if the forest itself had been holding its breath all these years, and finally, it could exhale. The fire in Maple Ridge was over. But the truth, once lit, would never go out. Spring returned to Maple Ridge with a softness the town hadn't felt in years. The snow had melted from the ridges, revealing the familiar stretch of pine trees and the dirt road that once led to Hannah Dawson's house. The fire was long gone, the trial over, and yet the echo of everything that happened still lingered like smoke that refused to clear. The case had ended, but the story hadn't. For some, justice had arrived. For others, it was just another kind of loss. Rachel Dawson didn't expect peace. She'd learned too much to believe in it. The verdict had given her something close to closure, but peace, real peace, was still out of reach. Her sister's name had been cleared, her truth restored, but every time Rachel drove past Ridge Road, she felt the same hollow pull in her chest. She'd spent 7 years chasing answers, and now that she had them, she wasn't sure what to do with the quiet that followed. Eli Sanders kept his word. After the sentencing, he visited the Dawsons one last time, bringing a box filled with copies of the court transcripts, evidence summaries, and digital files. He placed it on Rachel's kitchen table and said, "This belongs to you. Every line, every page, you earned it." He didn't stay long. The job had taken its toll, and he was already being called to another case. But before leaving, he looked at her and added softly, "Some truths don't close wounds. They just stop them from getting worse." Michael Hendricks was sentenced to 25 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for 15. During sentencing, he didn't speak. His attorney read a statement about remorse and regret, but those words sounded hollow in the quiet courtroom. He kept his eyes down, not on Rachel, not on the judge, but on the floor, as if everything he had built, his career, his image, his control, had finally turned to dust beneath his feet. After the trial, Maple Ridge changed in small, almost invisible ways. The fire department got new leadership, young recruits joined with new energy, and the old sheriff's office was repainted and reorganized. People started talking about accountability again. For the first time, the county didn't feel untouchable. The truth had cracked something open, something that couldn't be repaired, but maybe didn't need to be. For Rachel, life shifted slowly. The town that once turned its back on her now stopped her in grocery stores, offered quiet condolences, or simply nodded in respect. She didn't need apologies, she needed time. She kept working as a paralegal for a small firm in town, the same job she had nearly abandoned years earlier. But now, she used her experience differently. She began helping families who'd lost loved ones in unsolved cases. Families like hers, people still waiting for someone to listen. Late one afternoon, she visited the memorial near what was once her sister's house. The plaque gleamed faintly in the fading light. She believed truth would survive the fire. Rachel knelt beside it, brushing away fallen pine needles. "You were right," she whispered. Her reflection shimmered in the bronze surface, older, harder, but still standing. Meanwhile, Sanders's office quietly released the official closing report. It detailed every discovery, the voice analysis, the accelerant link, the false alibis, the witness statements. But what struck readers most was a single paragraph near the end. Had it not been for the persistence of the victim's sister, this case might have remained classified as undetermined. Her efforts represent the essential balance between law and humanity. It was rare for a document like that to carry emotion, but everyone who read it could feel it. In prison, Michael Hendricks adapted to a different kind of silence. His days were predictable: work, meals, lights out. The uniform replaced his badge. The walls replaced his authority. A local reporter once tried to visit him for an interview, but he declined. The only words he sent out came in a short handwritten letter to Sanders months later. It read, "I made choices I thought I could control. I was wrong. Tell her I'm sorry." Sanders never delivered the note. He kept it sealed in his drawer. Some apologies, he thought, are meant to stay between the guilty and the ghosts. As the months passed, Rachel's story began to reach beyond Arkansas. A national true crime podcast featured the Maple Ridge case, focusing on corruption, family, and the endurance of truth. Listeners around the country heard Hannah's voice, not her last words, but the stories people told about her kindness, her quiet strength, her love of teaching. For once, she wasn't just a victim. She was a person again. Rachel never listened to the podcast in full. She said it was enough to know that people remembered. What mattered to her was the future, not reliving the fire, but making sure no one else had to live through one like it. She started a local foundation, the Hannah Fund, dedicated to supporting families navigating cold cases. Within a year, it became a state-recognized program, offering legal and forensic assistance to rural communities often overlooked. On the first anniversary of the verdict, Rachel returned to Ridge Road. The foundation team had helped her plant a small garden on the property, rows of wildflowers, lavender, and a young oak tree in the center. She stood there as the evening light filtered through the branches, casting long shadows across the ground. The sound of wind in the pines felt different now, less like morning, more like memory. Sanders visited occasionally, though less often now. Each time, they spoke less about the case and more about life. Once, as they walked past the garden, he said quietly, "You know, every prosecutor dreams of closure, but it's people like you who make it possible." Rachel smiled faintly. "Closure isn't real," she said. "But understanding is. That's enough." The town continued to rebuild its rhythm. Children played where crime scene tape once flooded, and new families moved into homes nearby, unaware of what those woods had seen. Life had a way of layering over the past, but the past never fully disappeared. One summer evening, as twilight painted the horizon pink and gold, Rachel drove up to the ridge one last time. The oak tree had grown taller, its branches reaching toward the fading sky. She placed a single candle on the ground beneath it, shielding the flame from the wind until it steadied. In the distance, lightning flickered far beyond the hills, silent, harmless, beautiful. Her voice, soft but certain, broke the stillness. "You were right, Hannah. The truth doesn't burn." As she turned to leave, the camera would linger, the candlelight flickering against the bronze plaque, the faint hum of cicadas filling the air, and the last rays of sunlight catching on the word that mattered most, truth. Maple Ridge was quiet again. Not the heavy quiet of denial, but the kind that comes after a storm, the sound of a town learning to breathe again. And though the fire had once taken everything, what it left behind would last longer than any flame. Truth, memory, and the simple resilience of a sister who refused to let either die. The 7th year after the fire was the first one that felt ordinary. The kind of ordinary that Maple Ridge hadn't known in a long time. The courthouse was quiet, the papers stopped printing her name, and the roads leading out of town looked just like they used to, empty, sun-worn, and endless. But for Rachel Dawson, the silence didn't mean an ending. It meant she could finally hear everything she'd missed while chasing the truth. She still kept her sister's notebook, the one Hannah had written in before everything went dark. The cover was scorched on the edges, the ink faint in some places, but the words were still there. Little reminders of who she had been, grocery lists, sketches of the garden she wanted to plant, notes for a children's book she never got to finish. Sometimes Rachel would sit on her porch in the evenings, flip through the pages, and feel like she could still hear her sister humming somewhere nearby. Eli Sanders had moved on to a position with the state's attorney office in Little Rock. The Maple Ridge case had made him a quiet name in circles that valued persistence over glory. But even in the city, he kept a photo on his desk, a still frame from the courtroom, showing Rachel in the front row, her hands clasped, her face set in determination. He once told a colleague that the case reminded him why the law mattered, not because it always fixed what was broken, but because sometimes it helped people stop breaking. Michael Hendricks remained behind bars, serving out his sentence. Prison had reduced him to silence. The man who once commanded a room now kept mostly to himself. Guards describe him as polite, distant, and obsessed with books about fire dynamics, maybe out of habit, maybe out of guilt. Once a month, he received a letter. Always from the same person. Rachel never signed her name, but she didn't need to. Each envelope contained a single line, "Truth doesn't burn." He never wrote back. Maple Ridge itself began to heal in small ways that didn't make headlines. The fire department organized safety workshops for local families. A new fire chief, a woman named Claire Below, led with quiet conviction, making sure her department operated with transparency. She'd grown up in the next county over and said she took the job because she believed in the people who still wanted to make the town better. When asked about the Dawson case, she said only, "It taught us what happens when power forgets accountability." The Dawson property was now something of a landmark, though not officially. People passing through sometimes stopped to leave flowers or small keepsakes by the plaque. No one called it a memorial anymore. It was simply Hannah's place. Rachel didn't visit as often as she used to, but when she did, she always went at sunset, when the sky turned gold behind the trees. That was Hannah's favorite time of day. In late summer, a filmmaker from a small independent studio came to town to make a short documentary about the case. Rachel hesitated at first, but eventually agreed to an interview. She met the crew under the oak tree that now shaded most of the garden. The director asked her how it felt to have closure after all those years. Rachel smiled faintly, shaking her head. "Closure's not real," she said. "It's just a word people use to make loss sound tidy. What you get instead is understanding. And that's enough." They asked her what she remembered most about her sister. Rachel thought for a long time before answering. Her laugh, she said quietly, and how she always thought people were better than they seemed, even when she was wrong. The camera lingered on her face for a moment before fading to a shot of the oak leaves moving in the wind. Later, when the documentary aired online, it reached thousands of viewers. Most people didn't know the case, but they felt something real in her words, a mixture of grief and grace. A year later, Rachel received a letter postmarked from the state prison. It wasn't from Michael, but from a volunteer chaplain who worked there. He wrote that Michael had been diagnosed with heart failure and had asked to speak to her before his health declined further. She didn't respond right away. For weeks, the letter sat unopened on her counter, the edges curling in the summer humidity. Finally, one evening, she picked it up and read it again. 2 weeks later, she drove 3 hours north to the facility. The meeting room was sterile, with grey walls and flickering lights. When Michael entered, he looked older, hair thinner, shoulders stooped, eyes dimmed but still sharp. He sat across from her, the sound of his chains faint but constant. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "I didn't think you'd come," he said. "I didn't think I would either," she replied. He nodded, eyes fixed on the table. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to say I remember her laugh too." Rachel exhaled, the air heavy in her chest. "You took everything from her," she said softly. "And from all of us. You don't get to have her laugh." Michael's lips tightened. "You're right." For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights. Then Rachel stood, gathering her coat. "You can keep your sorry," she said. "I don't need it." As she walked out, she didn't look back. The door closed behind her with a dull metallic click, and the world outside felt suddenly wide again. The wind was cool, the evening quiet. Back in Maple Ridge, autumn rolled in slowly, painting the hills in shades of gold and red. Rachel returned to her work, to her quiet home, to her life. She kept volunteering with the foundation, helping other families who refused to let silence bury their truth. Her name began appearing in small articles and interviews, not as a victim sister, but as an advocate. People called her resilient. She preferred the word relentless. On the anniversary of the fire, she hosted a small gathering at Hannah's place. A few townspeople came, along with some of the foundation's volunteers and even Claire Below. They stood around the oak tree, shared stories, and let the evening settle into stillness. As the light faded, Rachel lit a single candle beneath the plaque. The flame flickered but didn't go out, even when the wind began to stir. She looked around at the faces illuminated by the glow. Some were tearful, some were smiling. It wasn't mourning anymore, it was remembrance. A kind of peace born from persistence. Later that night, Rachel walked alone along Ridge Road. The moon hung low, and the crickets sang in the tall grass. She stopped once, halfway down the path, and looked back. From where she stood, she could still see the faint light of the candle flickering through the trees. It looked small from a distance, but steady. Her voice was barely more than a whisper when she spoke, carried off by the wind. "It's over now, Hannah. You can rest." Then she turned and kept walking. The camera would follow her silhouette down the dirt road, the sound of her footsteps fading beneath the hum of night. The oak tree would remain glowing in the background, its branches swaying gently, the candle's flame steady against the darkness. And as the screen slowly faded to black, one line would appear, quiet, simple, and true. Truth doesn't burn. It survives. By the time the 8th year came, Maple Ridge had settled into a rhythm of quiet normalcy that only small towns could understand. The people went back to their routines, the gossip faded, and new stories took root. But beneath the surface, the fire still lived, not as smoke or ash, but as memory. It had changed everyone who'd been close to it. For Rachel Dawson, it was no longer a wound. It had become a part of her, something she carried not as pain, but as purpose. She spent her mornings at the foundation office, a small converted library near the courthouse. The Hannah Fund had grown beyond what she'd imagined. There were volunteers now, students, retirees, people who'd followed the story and decided to do something. They collected records, helped families write letters to prosecutors, and hosted support circles for those still waiting for justice. Rachel oversaw everything, her calm voice and meticulous notes guiding them. She didn't crave attention, she wanted results. Every wall in the office carried a story. Some cases had names written in black ink, others still blank, waiting for the truth to surface. Rachel knew that most wouldn't get their closure. But she also knew that sometimes, all people needed was for someone to say their loved one's name out loud again. To make them real. To keep them from vanishing twice, once in life, once in memory. Eli Sanders still called her once a month, usually late in the evening when both were done with work. He'd tell her about new cases, new frustrations, and the politics that came with being a state attorney. "Every time we fix one thing," he said once, "something else breaks." Rachel had laughed softly. "That's life," she replied. "You just have to decide what's worth fixing." That winter, an old journalist named Frank Latham came to see her. He was writing a book about unsolved cases across the South, and he wanted to include the Dawson fire as an example of persistence and reform. Rachel hesitated, but eventually agreed to meet him at Hannah's place. They stood beneath the oak tree, the leaves long gone, its bare branches stretching against the grey sky. Frank asked her questions that no one had dared to ask before. "Do you think justice was done?" Rachel thought for a long time before answering. "Justice is complicated," she said finally. "The law punished the man who did it. But justice? That's what happens afterward. It's what you build from the wreckage." Frank nodded, scribbling in his notebook. "And forgiveness?" he asked. Rachel looked at the plaque by her feet, the one that read "Truth doesn't burn." "Forgiveness isn't the opposite of justice," she said. "It's just the part that comes after you stop expecting fairness." The wind stirred through the empty trees, carrying her words like echoes. Weeks later, Frank's article appeared online. It wasn't sensational or cruel. It was honest. He wrote about the fire, the investigation, the trial, and the people who refused to let it be forgotten. He called Rachel the quiet spine of Maple Ridge. The piece spread further than she expected. Podcasts mentioned it, a few national outlets picked it up, and donations to the foundation doubled overnight. For the first time, Rachel realized that Hannah's story had stopped being just about tragedy. It had become something larger, a reminder that truth, once uncovered, doesn't die easily. In the spring of 2026, the oak tree began to blossom for the first time. Small white buds dotted its branches, shimmering under the morning sun. Locals said it was a good omen. Rachel took it as a sign that life was still capable of beauty, even after fire. She organized the first annual Truth Vigil, a gathering of families who had lost loved ones to unresolved crimes. They came from across the state, some driving all night. The garden was filled with candles, photographs, and quiet conversation. Rachel stood in front of the crowd as dusk settled over Ridge Road. Her voice was steady but soft. "We are not here to reopen wounds," she said. "We are here to remind the world that names matter. That memory matters. That truth doesn't fade just because time wants it to." She didn't speak long. She didn't need to. When she finished, the garden filled with the sound of matches striking, candles flaring to life one by one. The oak tree glowed in their light, and for a moment, it looked like the fire had returned. Only this time, it was gentle, alive, and kind. After the vigil, she sat alone on the bench near the tree. Eli appeared beside her, his coat collar turned up against the cool air. "You ever think about leaving all this behind?" he asked quietly. Rachel smiled faintly. "Sometimes. But every time I try, something reminds me why I can't. This place, this story, it's not just Hannah's anymore. It belongs to everyone who refuses to give up." He nodded, eyes on the horizon. Then maybe that's what justice really is. Not punishment. Not closure. Just persistence. Rachel turned to him. Maybe. Or maybe it's just love refusing to die. The months passed quietly after that. The foundation grew, new volunteers joined, and the town slowly modernized. New stores, new homes, new families. But some things never changed. Every evening, the wind still whispered through the pines, carrying traces of the past. One afternoon, while sorting through old case files, Rachel found something she hadn't seen in years, a small cassette tape labeled Home, July 2017. She didn't remember packing it away. The handwriting was Hannah's. Her heart skipped as she slid it into an old player. The tape crackled, then came the faint sound of laughter. Hannah's voice filled the room, bright and unguarded. "Testing. 1, 2, 3. I think it's working. If you find this, Ratch, it means I finally fixed the recorder." She laughed again. "You probably think I'm talking nonsense, but I wanted to save this moment. Just us, just home. In case things ever change." Rachel froze, unable to breathe. The recording went quiet for a second, then Hannah's voice came back, softer now. "If you ever doubt anything, remember, we were happy once. And that matters. Don't let anyone take that from you." The tape clicked to an end. Rachel sat there for a long time, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. For the first time, she wasn't crying from grief, but from gratitude. Her sister's voice, preserved through time, had reached across 8 years to remind her that even in darkness, there had been light. That night, Rachel walked again to the oak tree. The stars were sharp and bright above, and the candlelight from the garden danced across the plaque. She placed the cassette gently at its base, beside the flowers. "This was always for you," she whispered. A soft wind rustled through the branches, and for just a moment, it sounded like laughter again. The camera would linger on the garden, the oak tree swaying, candles flickering, and the distant hum of nights settling over Maple Ridge. A quiet narration would fade in. Time moves on, and people forget. But truth doesn't. It lives in the voices we save, in the names we remember, and in the hearts that refuse to let the fire die. Because the fire was never just destruction. It was light. It was warning. It was memory. And it still burns, softly, in Maple Ridge. The shot would widen, showing Ridge Road winding into the distance, illuminated by the glow of countless small candles. The night sky would stretch above, vast, endless, and full of quiet stars. Fade to black. Truth doesn't burn. It survives. The 9th year came quietly, with the kind of stillness that only small towns seem to know. The nights were longer now, the winters colder. But Maple Ridge had changed in ways no one could fully see. Beneath the paint of new storefronts, behind the laughter of children playing where the fire once burned, there was a weight that never left. Not heavy enough to crush, but strong enough to remember. Rachel Dawson didn't talk much about the past anymore. She didn't need to. The people who mattered already knew, and those who didn't had moved on to other stories. The Hannah Fund had become a state-recognized nonprofit with offices across Arkansas and Louisiana. Families wrote to her every week, some asking for help reopening old cases, others just wanting someone to listen. She answered every letter, even the ones that broke her heart. "Truth matters," she'd write, "even when it comes too late." Her house was quieter these days. The walls no longer held grief, just quiet purpose. The same cassette tape still sat on her bookshelf, though she hadn't played it since the night she left it at Hannah's place. The memory of her sister's voice was enough. She didn't need to hear it again to remember it. Some things stay imprinted in you long after sound fades. Every morning, Rachel walked the same dirt path along Ridge Road, a thermos of coffee in one hand, a folder of case notes in the other. She'd stop near the hilltop overlook and watch the sunrise melt through the trees. It wasn't nostalgia that brought her peace, it was understanding. The kind that comes when you finally accept that pain doesn't go away, it just changes shape. In early spring, she received a letter from Eli Sanders. He'd been nominated for Attorney General and was moving to Washington, D.C. He wrote with his usual humility, plain, direct, and heavy with respect. "If this new job means anything," he said, "it's because people like you reminded me what the law is supposed to do, protect truth, not just preserve order." Enclosed was a small silver coin engraved with the state seal. On the back, he'd had 2 words etched, "Keep going." Rachel smiled when she read it. She slipped the coin into her coat pocket, where it stayed, a quiet token from someone who understood what endurance really looked like. The same week, a documentary crew arrived from Little Rock to film a follow-up on the Maple Ridge case. The first film had become a regional success, praised for its honesty and restraint. Now, nearly a decade later, they wanted to revisit the people who had lived through it. Rachel agreed, but only if they filmed at sunset. She said that was the only time Hannah would have approved. The scene opened at Hannah's place, the oak tree now towering, its roots strong and visible beneath the earth. The bronze plaque had weathered, but the engraving still shone under the light. "Truth doesn't burn. It survives." Around it, the wildflower garden had grown full and vibrant, lavender, goldenrod, and white daisies swaying in the warm wind. Rachel sat on the bench beneath the tree as the crew set up. Her hair had more grey now, but her eyes held the same quiet focus. When the interviewer asked her what justice meant after all these years, she paused for a long time before answering. "Justice isn't about punishment," she said softly. "It's about restoration, giving back what was taken, even if it's just the truth. My sister didn't get her years back, but she got her story back. That's something." The crew filmed her as the light began to fade, the camera catching the soft reflection of sunset in her eyes. When they finished, Rachel stayed behind, letting the wind move through the branches. Somewhere, she thought, Hannah was watching, not as a ghost, but as memory stitched into every sound, every color, every quiet breath of the ridge. That summer, Maple Ridge hosted its second Truth Vigil. Families came from across the state, lighting candles for lost loved ones. The air was warm and thick with the scent of pine and smoke. Rachel walked among them, greeting each person, listening to their stories. She didn't have all the answers, she never pretended to. What she offered instead was presence, patience, and understanding. Near the end of the evening, a young girl approached her, maybe 16, carrying a framed photo of her mother. Her voice trembled as she said, "You're the reason I want to study criminal law." Rachel's heart tightened, but she smiled gently. "Then promise me one thing," she said. "Always listen to the quiet ones. The truth usually hides with them." The girl nodded, clutching the photo tighter. That single exchange stayed with Rachel for weeks. As autumn arrived again, she made one more visit to the state prison. Michael Hendricks had died 3 months earlier of heart failure. His attorney had sent her a letter, saying Michael left behind a written confession addressed only to her. She'd refused to read it at first. But now, sitting under the oak tree, she unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was unsteady but clear. "I can't ask forgiveness. But I want you to know that the fire didn't start from hate. It started from fear, fear of being seen, of losing control, of the truth coming out. You were right all along. The truth doesn't burn. It burned me." She folded the letter back, staring at the horizon. There were no tears this time, just quiet understanding. She didn't forgive him, not fully, but she accepted that even the guilty sometimes seek peace. That was their burden to carry, not hers. In late November, Rachel attended the dedication of a new community center in town. The building was named the Dawson House, a space for families, advocates, and volunteers working on unresolved cases. The mayor gave a short speech, thanking her for her years of persistence. Rachel stood quietly in the back, not comfortable with applause, but proud nonetheless. After the ceremony, she walked outside. The sky above Maple Ridge was soft and grey, the kind that came before snow. She could smell wood smoke in the distance and hear laughter from the children playing near the square. For the first time, the sound didn't ache. It felt alive. She made her way home along the familiar dirt road. The trees whispered in the wind, the same rhythm they'd kept for nearly a decade. When she reached the turn toward Hannah's place, she stopped. The oak tree glowed faintly in the distance, not from fire, but from hundreds of candles flickering across the garden, left by strangers who had come to honor truth in their own quiet way. Rachel stood there, hands in her coat pockets, breath rising in the cold. The voiceover would fade in here, her voice calm, steady, and honest. People think stories end when the truth comes out. But that's not how it works. Truth is alive. It keeps moving, changing hands, finding new homes. Maybe that's what my sister wanted all along. Not just justice, but continuity. A promise that the light wouldn't go out. She took one last look at the flickering candles, then turned back toward the road, her figure framed by the golden glow behind her. As the camera pulled back, the ridge stretched wide, the trees, the lights, the horizon melting into a soft dawn. The narration continued. The fire in Maple Ridge didn't destroy everything. It revealed what was already there: fear, love, and truth. And truth, no matter how long it hides, always finds a way back to the surface. The screen would fade to black, and the final words would appear, the same ones etched into the plaque beneath the oak tree. Truth doesn't burn. It survives.